In the autumn of 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat across the table from Japan's political and military leadership and told them, as plainly as he had told them for years, that a war against the United States was a war Japan could not win. He was, by that point, the single most respected naval officer in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had lived and studied in America, who understood American industrial capacity better than almost anyone in Tokyo, and who had spent years quietly working to prevent exactly the war his country was now sliding toward. Weeks later, that same admiral would sit in his flagship's operations room and finalize the plans for the single most devastating surprise attack in American naval history. This is the story of how a man who genuinely believed the war could not be won ended up designing and leading the attack that started it, and what that contradiction reveals about the impossible position Yamamoto occupied in the final months before Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's rise through the Imperial Japanese Navy's officer ranks also placed him, for a formative period earlier in his career, directly in the middle of international naval arms control negotiations, serving as part of Japan's delegation to naval disarmament conferences in the 1920s and early 1930s, where the major naval powers, including the United States, Britain, and Japan, negotiated treaty limits on capital ship tonnage and construction. This direct diplomatic experience gave Yamamoto first-hand exposure to how American and British naval planners thought about strategic balance and industrial capacity, further reinforcing the specific, technically grounded understanding of Western naval and industrial power that would later inform his private warnings against war. An understanding built not from abstract theory, but from years of direct negotiation and observation, alongside the very naval establishments Japan would eventually go to war against. Isoroku Yamamoto's path to becoming one of the most unusual senior officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy began long before the war, in a set of formative experiences almost none of his fellow admirals shared. As a young officer in the years following the First World War, Yamamoto was sent to study at Harvard University, an assignment that placed him directly inside American academic and social life, at a level of immersion few Japanese military officers of his generation ever experienced. He later served 2 separate tours as a naval attaché in Washington, work that took him traveling across the United States, visiting automobile factories in Detroit, oil fields in Texas, and industrial centers whose sheer scale left a lasting and, by his own later account, deeply unsettling impression on him. What Yamamoto took from these years in America was not admiration in any simple sense, but a cold, unsentimental assessment of industrial capacity that few of his colleagues in Tokyo, men who had spent their careers almost entirely within Japan's own naval and political institutions, were equipped to make with the same authority. He understood, in concrete terms most Japanese military planners did not, just how many ships, how many aircraft, and how much steel and oil the United States could produce, once its economy fully converted to wartime output, an industrial reality that dwarfed anything Japan's more limited resource base could hope to match in a prolonged conflict. This understanding became the foundation of a conviction Yamamoto carried for the rest of his career, that Japan could win a short war against the United States, if it won one at all, but could not win a long one under any circumstances. Yamamoto's time in America extended beyond official attaché duties into a genuine, if idiosyncratic, personal fascination with American culture, including an enthusiasm for poker and bridge that he pursued with the same intense, calculating focus he brought to naval strategy, reportedly becoming skilled enough at these games to support extra income during his time abroad. This personal familiarity with American life, rare among Japanese officers of his generation who typically had little direct exposure to the country beyond formal diplomatic settings, gave Yamamoto's later warnings about American resolve and capacity a texture and specificity that purely theoretical assessments from officers who had never left Japan simply could not match. Through the 1930s, as Japan's military leadership grew increasingly aligned with expansionist policy in China, and eventually alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy through the Tripartite Pact, Yamamoto emerged as one of the few senior naval officers willing to speak openly against the drift toward a war with the United States and Britain that this expansionist policy made increasingly likely. He argued forcefully within Japan's naval leadership against the alliance with Germany specifically, believing it would inevitably drag Japan into exactly the kind of confrontation with American and British naval power that Japan's more limited industrial base could not sustain over time. His outspoken opposition to these policies was significant enough and unpopular enough among Japan's more hardline militarist factions that Yamamoto reportedly received serious threats against his life from ultra-nationalist elements within Japan who viewed his caution as something close to disloyalty. Yamamoto's outspoken position within these debates was not without professional cost even before any question of active duty against the West arose. He reportedly kept a will prepared during the periods of most intense ultra-nationalist agitation against him, a precaution reflecting a genuine and specific personal danger he faced within his own country's political environment, for holding and voicing views that a more cautious, self-protective officer might have kept entirely private, a level of personal risk that adds a further layer of complexity to any simple reading of his later actions as either straightforward hypocrisy. This political reality shaped Yamamoto's career in a specific and, in retrospect, almost darkly ironic way. Some of Yamamoto's own colleagues and biographers have suggested that his appointment to command the Combined Fleet, Japan's most powerful and prestigious naval command, was engineered in part, specifically, to remove him from Tokyo, where his outspoken political opposition to war with the West made him a liability to political and military figures pushing in the opposite direction, and to place him instead in an operational command role at sea, further from the political center of decision-making where his influence over policy could be more easily contained. In other words, the same qualities, honesty, independence, and a willingness to voice unpopular truths, that made Yamamoto uniquely qualified to warn Japan against war with America, were also the qualities that helped ensure his warnings would ultimately be sidelined rather than heeded. The Tripartite Pact debate specifically placed Yamamoto in direct, documented conflict with senior figures in the Japanese army and with more hardline elements of the Navy itself, who favored closer alignment with Germany as a counterweight to American and British influence in the Pacific. Yamamoto's argument, consistent with his broader industrial analysis, held that an alliance explicitly targeting the Western democracies would make eventual conflict with the United States and Britain nearly inevitable, a conflict he believed Japan's more limited industrial base made unwise to invite deliberately through treaty commitments to Germany's own expansionist ambitions in Europe. His opposition placed him, for a period, in a genuinely precarious political position within a military and political establishment, increasingly dominated by figures who viewed such caution as insufficiently committed to Japan's broader strategic ambitions in Asia. By the summer and autumn of 1941, with American oil embargoes squeezing Japan's war machine and negotiations between Washington and Tokyo failing to produce a diplomatic resolution, the political momentum within the Japanese government had shifted decisively toward war, a direction Yamamoto had argued against for years but could no longer prevent through political means alone. Faced with the reality that Japan's civilian and military leadership had effectively already decided on war, regardless of his own private assessment, Yamamoto made a decision that has puzzled and fascinated historians ever since. Rather than continue to resist a war he believed Japan could not win, he threw himself into designing the single most aggressive possible opening strike available to Japan, reasoning that if war was now unavoidable, Japan's only realistic chance, however slim, lay in inflicting damage so severe and so immediate against American naval power that Washington might be forced to negotiate before its industrial advantage could be fully brought to bear. This reasoning produced the plan for Pearl Harbor, an attack designed specifically to cripple the United States Pacific Fleet in a single devastating strike delivered without warning, buying Japan, in Yamamoto's own calculation, perhaps 6 months to a year of unchallenged operational freedom across the Pacific before American industrial mobilization caught up and began reversing the balance of naval power. Yamamoto reportedly told close colleagues privately, in the weeks before the attack, that he could guarantee Japan's spectacular success for perhaps the first 6 months to a year of the war, but that he could promise nothing beyond that time frame, a caveat that reflected the same clear-eyed industrial assessment that had shaped his thinking for years, now applied not to arguing against the war, but to designing its opening move as effectively as possible, given that the war itself was no longer something he had the political power to prevent. The specific planning process behind Pearl Harbor reflected the same rigorous, almost obsessive attention to operational detail that had characterized Yamamoto's approach throughout his career, regardless of his personal views on the wisdom of the underlying policy. He pushed his planning staff to consider and rehearse the mission extensively, insisting on realistic training exercises that simulated the actual conditions his pilots would face, and personally intervened in technical problems, including the development of modified shallow-water torpedoes needed to make an attack against ships moored in Pearl Harbor's relatively confined harbor tactically feasible at all. This level of personal, hands-on engagement with the operation's technical execution stood in stark contrast to his private, repeatedly voiced skepticism about the war's ultimate winnability, a duality that colleagues who worked closely with him during this period consistently described as genuine rather than performed. A man who compartmentalized his professional execution of orders from his private strategic judgment about where those orders would ultimately lead. The apparent contradiction at the heart of Yamamoto's actions, a man who opposed the war designing its most audacious opening attack, becomes considerably less puzzling once examined through the specific institutional logic of the Imperial Japanese Navy's culture of duty and hierarchy that Yamamoto operated within. Japanese military culture of this period placed enormous weight on the principle that once a policy decision had been made at the appropriate level of civilian and military leadership, officers were expected to execute that decision to the very best of their professional ability, regardless of whatever private reservations they may have voiced during the deliberative process that preceded the final decision. For Yamamoto, having made his case against the war repeatedly, and having lost that argument within Japan's political and military leadership, continuing to resist once the decision had been finalized would have represented a breach of exactly the kind of institutional discipline his entire career had been built upon. This does not mean Yamamoto's later actions were free of genuine internal conflict, and multiple accounts from officers who served closely with him during this period describe a man who continued to express private reservations about the war, even as he worked with total professional commitment to make its opening strike as devastating as possible. He was reported, in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor's tactical success, to have expressed to colleagues a mixture of professional satisfaction at the operation's execution alongside a distinctly somber awareness of what the attack had actually set in motion, reportedly remarking, in a phrase whose precise wording remains debated among historians, but whose essential sentiment multiple sources agree he expressed in some form, that Japan had merely awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with a terrible resolve, a formulation that captured, in a single image, both the tactical triumph of the moment and Yamamoto's own long-standing, unchanged conviction about how the broader war would ultimately end. Correspondence and private statements attributed to Yamamoto in the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor, examined by historians in the decades since, through both Japanese and American archival sources, consistently reflect this same underlying tension rather than any straightforward triumphalism about the attack's success. He reportedly expressed to close associates a specific and recurring worry that the Japanese public and much of the military leadership in Tokyo had drawn exactly the wrong lesson from Pearl Harbor's tactical success, mistaking a single devastating opening strike for evidence that the broader war itself could be won, when Yamamoto's own private assessment remained that the attack had purchased time and advantage rather than anything resembling a guarantee of ultimate victory. The 6-month to 1-year window Yamamoto had privately estimated Japan might enjoy before American industrial mobilization began reversing the balance of the war played out with a precision that, in retrospect, closely tracked his own private predictions. Japan's opening months brought a nearly unbroken string of victories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, exactly the kind of rapid, overwhelming success Yamamoto had believed the Pearl Harbor strike could purchase. But by June of 1942, almost precisely at the 6-month mark, Yamamoto had privately estimated, the Battle of Midway inflicted catastrophic losses on Japan's carrier air power in a single morning. A defeat that historians studying Yamamoto's own pre-war predictions have noted arrived almost exactly within the time frame he had told colleagues Japan's advantage would last, before American strength began to turn the tide decisively. The precision with which events unfolded relative to Yamamoto's own private 6-month to 1-year estimate has become, among historians studying his pre-war predictions, one of the more striking examples of accurate strategic forecasting by any senior military commander of the entire Second World War. A forecast made not from the comfortable distance of hindsight, but stated privately, in advance, by the officer who then went on to personally design and execute the operation whose consequences he had already, in essence, predicted with unsettling accuracy. Isoroku Yamamoto did not live to see how completely his own pre-war warnings would ultimately be vindicated. In April of 1943, American codebreakers, reading Japanese naval communications with a thoroughness Yamamoto himself had no way of knowing about, intercepted his precise travel itinerary for an inspection tour near Bougainville, and American P-38 fighters intercepted and shot down his aircraft, ending the life of the man who had spent years warning against a war he ultimately felt professionally bound to help wage as effectively as circumstances allowed. It is worth being direct about how historians have handled the most famous line attributed to Yamamoto, the remark about awakening a sleeping giant, because its exact provenance remains genuinely disputed. No verified primary source confirms Yamamoto wrote or spoke those precise words at the specific moment. Popular accounts and later films have placed them, and some historians regard the quotation as likely apocryphal, or at minimum embellished in its exact wording over decades of retelling. What multiple independent sources do corroborate, through separate accounts from officers who interacted with Yamamoto in the attack's immediate aftermath, is that he expressed sentiments of this general character, satisfaction mixed with grave concern about what had now been set irrevocably in motion, even if the specific poetic phrasing attached to the moment in later popular memory may not represent his exact contemporaneous words. The historical assessment of Yamamoto's role in the path to Pearl Harbor remains, even decades later, a genuinely contested and complicated question, rather than a simple story of hypocrisy or straightforward tragic duty. Some historians have emphasized the genuine moral and professional tension in Yamamoto's position, a man doing his utmost to prevent a catastrophe, and then, having failed, doing his utmost to win a war he privately believed was likely unwinnable in the long run. A combination of institutional loyalty and professional excellence that some have framed as a kind of tragic integrity. Others have offered a more skeptical reading, noting that whatever his private reservations, Yamamoto's design and execution of the Pearl Harbor attack was undertaken with genuine tactical brilliance and personal commitment, and that his later private expressions of doubt do not erase his direct responsibility for planning and leading the operation that brought the United States into a war he had spent years warning could not be won. There is also a broader question historians continue to debate about how much individual agency a senior officer in Yamamoto's specific institutional position actually possessed once Japan's civilian and military leadership had collectively committed to war. A question that touches on much larger and more general debates in military history about the responsibility of skilled professional officers who execute policies they privately oppose. Some scholars examining Yamamoto's case have drawn comparisons to other historical instances of senior military officers across different countries and conflicts, who found themselves professionally bound to execute strategies they had personally argued against. A recurring tension in military institutions built around strict hierarchical loyalty once a policy decision has been finalized at the appropriate level of civilian and military authority. What is not seriously disputed by historians studying this period is the underlying industrial and strategic analysis Yamamoto brought to his pre-war warnings, an assessment that proved, across the full course of the war that followed, to be almost entirely correct. Japan's shipyards, aircraft factories, and pilot training programs never came close to matching the scale of American wartime industrial mobilization once it reached full capacity. Exactly the imbalance Yamamoto had witnessed firsthand during his years living and studying in the United States, decades before the war began. The tragedy of Yamamoto's career, as many historians have since framed it, lies less in any contradiction between his words and his actions than in the fact that the one man in Japan's naval leadership who most clearly understood why the war could not be won was also, through a combination of professional duty and institutional loyalty, the man who ultimately did more than perhaps any other single individual to ensure that war began as decisively and devastatingly as it did. If you want to understand how a man who spent years warning his own government against a war it could not win ended up designing and leading that war's opening strike, and what that impossible position reveals about duty, honesty, and institutional loyalty in the final months before Pearl Harbor, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.